Good afternoon, and welcome to a conversation with Dr. Allen Dieterich-Ward. My name is Marcy Mowry, and I'm the president of the Pennsylvania Parks and Forests Foundation. And as I said, with me today is Dr. Allen Dieterich-Ward, a professor of history at Shippensburg University. Allen, thank you for being with us here today.
Marcy, as always, it is my absolute pleasure. Happy Black History Month. I'm super excited with our topic for our chat today.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Dieterich-Ward is the author of a newly released book called Cradle of Conservation: An Environmental History of Pennsylvania. And he's going to be joining us the third Wednesday of the month for the next few months to talk about different aspects of this book. And as you mentioned, Allen, it is Black History Month. And so we're going to look at this through the lens of Black history. And that seems like a great place to start, because the very first line of the book is, as Ralph Brock rose to give his presentation. So let's just start from there.
Sounds great. Yeah, sounds great. Yeah. So I've kind of gone through today and picked three different time periods and three different groups of people to really underscore the significance and importance of African-American Pennsylvanians kind of throughout the history of conservation, of environmentalism. And do you have my slideshow up quite yet, Marcy?
Yep, I can bring it up right now.
Yay. Okay. So as Marcy noted, the book starts with Ralph Brock in the conservation era. I'm also going to spend some time, in our brief little chat today, talking about the civil rights era, as well as the environmental justice era. So as Marcy noted, Cradle of Conservation actually starts with Ralph Brock. Mr. Brock was a member of the first class of trained foresters from the Pennsylvania Forest Academy in 1906. He was a protege of Joseph Rothrock, who's pictured on the cover of the book on Pulpit Rock down here in Franklin County, where I live, close to Shippensburg University. And Brock, Rothrock really saw something important in Brock, who he knew lived in the same town as him in Westchester. And he encouraged Brock to apply for inclusion in this brand new Pennsylvania Forestry Academy that the state created in the years after 1900. And in fact, he was so well respected both by his peers and by his faculty members that even before he graduated, he was the student superintendent of the nursery at the Pennsylvania Forestry Academy. Here's a picture of Rothrock from the cover. And here's a picture of Ralph Brock among the group of the first two classes of Pennsylvania foresters, along with the Pennsylvania Forest Reserve Commission. You can see Joseph Rothrock himself sitting at the table there, along with the other commissioners. Of course, I can't help but think that next month we'll be talking about another person in that room, Myra Lloyd Dock, who's always a fan favorite. Brock really had a gift. He was a nurseryman. He excelled at a time when, of course, there was widespread racism of people of color and of women, of course, but of people of color in this case in Pennsylvania. And this really created a lot of problems for Brock, despite kind of being hailed as a very, very gifted nurseryman. There was a quote from one of the other teachers at the Pennsylvania Forestry Academy that Brock, none of the boys could quite content himself being ordered around by a darky, a racial epithet of the time, regardless of his ability. And these tensions eventually resulted in Brock leaving the Forestry Academy, leaving Pennsylvania entirely. But his significance to conservation history doesn't end there. He actually comes to the attention, again, a very well respected nurseryman, comes to the attention of a number of really influential barons captains of industry, including John D. Rockefeller. And after Brock left his position at the Forestry Academy, and he never worked as a state forester again, but he eventually moved at the urging of John D. Rockefeller to New York City, where he lived the rest of his life, and became a nurseryman, a landscape gardener for the new Radio City Music Hall complex, Rockefeller Center, in New York City. And then later, his story actually goes to other parts of the civil rights movement, including serving as the landscape gardener for a number of really important, historically important housing complexes, including the Paul Laurence Dunbar Apartments in New York City that Rockefeller built as and named for a very well-known African-American poet, for housing, cooperative housing for African Americans. And then he ended his career actually at the Harlem River Houses in New York State, which as a landscaper, which was the first public housing complex for African Americans built with federal funds. So his story is one, I think, that really underscores, and here's a really great picture of him, one of my favorite pictures of Brock, with the other foresters trained at the Forest Academy. Brock's story, I think, for me, is one that really underscores the significance of people of color to the conservation movement throughout the Mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, and New York State, but also underscores the challenges, the racism, the bigotry that is going to kind of continually. People of color are going to have to fight with in order to succeed in conservation, and in order to be able to access the kinds of natural amenities, the beauty of nature, the public health benefits of nature that public policy is supposed to be granting to all Pennsylvanians. So, and that theme, I think, really carries through to this next time period and group of people that I want to talk about.
So before you jump into that,
please. And I'm happy to stop and we can talk at any time you want, Marcy.
Yeah, I mean,
let's talk about Brock.
Pops into my mind is what a loss for Pennsylvania.
Oh my heavens!
I mean, this is a time. This is 1903. Our forests had been ravaged with the demand for forests for a variety of projects. We were experiencing floods and wildfires, and we really needed all hands on deck. So it was a loss for Pennsylvania. Here's this gifted forester, this gifted nurseryman, and he moved on to Pennsylvania when we really could have used that training and that gift.
Yeah, and I think, to my mind, Marcy, that point really underscores, the PA Conservation Heritage Project and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and other state agencies. There are tensions kind of baked into public policies, right? And tensions that public administrators may not know the history of, right? May not fully understand. One of the areas that I think that is in some ways related to this is the development of state parks. Just as with national parks, the development of state parks requires dispossessing people of the land that they live in, right? That's kind of a key piece. And I'm thinking of the Laurel Highlands outside of Johnstown, in which there's still today lasting resentments from the descendants of folks, of people of color who had long-lasting community there, and were dispossessed of their land through eminent domain. And this initiative of the Conservation Heritage Project of getting at these untold stories is essential to understanding the history of Pennsylvania, of course, but also the ways in which that history can define relationships and all the way through the present day.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so on to the next thing. All right. So those of you who are in the know are going to recognize this is Levittown, Pennsylvania, of course, in outside of Philadelphia. And this is the second Levittown, of course, this kind of symbol of post-war suburbanization. Between 1952 and 1958, The home building company Levitt and Sons built more than 17,000 new homes when they were reaching their peak of this kind of factory assembly line construction. They had a a rate of a new house every 16 minutes, right? And this is the landscape. If that landscape I showed initially of sort of denuded woods was the landscape that created the conservation movement, in many ways, this is the landscape that creates the environmental movement because, when you think about it, the suburbanization is really kind of promising urban amenities, right? The convenience, the opportunities of the city, but with the natural world, right? The public health, the beauty, the trees, the green spaces of the countryside, right? And what happens, of course, is that many folks who move out there with these kind of promises of access to nature, find that nature gets paved over pretty quickly for more housing developments, right? And improperly installed sanitation results in sewage in their backyards, right? So this kind of experience of suburbanization, of this kind of American dream of convenience and access combined with nature, that really in many ways becomes the propelling feature that creates the environmental movement. But again, we have to remember that this suburbanization was segregated. Here in Pennsylvania, we had racial covenants that prevented people of color in the late 40s and early 50s from even being able to purchase homes in the suburbs. On top of kind of all of the other restrictions. The Levitts were kind of notorious for wanting to exclude African American people of color from their communities. And it's not until 1957 that the first people of color move into Levittown, and they do so sort of not buying directly from the Levitts, but buying from another couple who are moving out. And I think that this story of civil rights, we oftentimes think of environmentalism and the civil rights struggle as somehow being separate from one another, but they're oftentimes not. I mean, the civil rights movement is about ensuring that the quality of life, right, the opportunities that people, that Americans or Pennsylvanians are entitled to, are accessible to everyone, right? And natural amenities, nature, public health, those are the same kinds of amenities that people like William and Daisy Myers, who are the first people of color to move into Levittown, are looking for. And I should say, much like with Ralph Brock, their moving into Levittown was met with violence, hostility, bricks and crosses burned on their lawn, and demonstrations that went on for years. And they eventually things eventually settled down, and William Myers gets a job in Harrisburg. They eventually moved to Harrisburg. Moved to York, where Daisy, who has her 2 master's degrees, works in the York School District. And it is not, in this kind of story of the pioneers of these people moving to the suburbs, becomes this kind of very, very important untold story of environmentalism. It's in 2005. In 2005, Daisy Myers is invited back to Levittown, where she is given a public apology for the treatment that she and her family received. And Marcy, do you know what they do to celebrate or to sort of enshrine this kind of public ceremony of forgiveness or acknowledgement? She plants a tree. In front of Levittown City Hall to kind of commemorate this, this piece of environmental and civil rights history, right? So I think, again, sort of underscoring the importance of understanding environmental movement, civil rights movement as being part of one each together.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that we're all seeking the same thing.
Yeah.
Healthy places to live, safe places to raise our children, opportunities for the next generation that we may not have received. So, and I think pioneer is an appropriate word. They truly were pioneers.
Yeah, well, and you're bringing that up, particularly about thinking about children and the next generation. Really reminds me kind of another episode where civil rights and and environmentalism and the environmental movement overlap, and that's in the case of swimming pools, right? So public swimming pools, right, kind of a key area for enjoyment of the outdoors. Learning how to swim. We know that there are enormous disparities between different groups of people over knowing how to swim or being able to participate in swimming activities. And this isn't an accident. I mean, the public pool movement really emerges in the very late 19th century and early 20th century. And you see these huge public resorts, essentially, of swimming pools that are built either by cities like Pittsburgh or here, or by private developers. Like here we have in Caledonia State Park, a swimming pool that was built by a private developer in the early 20th century. But there was this enormous taboo of racial mixing, particularly in places where young white girls and young black boys were mixing with one another. There's a whole sort of awful heritage of racialized thinking in that regard, and it took more than a decade of civil rights advocacy. And you can see the sign here about the same kinds of signs of "I am a man," I should be entitled to equal employment, being sort of underscored as part of this civil rights struggle for access, in this case, to the Highland Park pool, one of these enormous recreation spaces in Pittsburgh. And it's not until 1951, that any real efforts are made to desegregate the Highland Park swimming pool. And here's a picture of kids in 52, and as late as 1962, and I don't doubt in some places later than that. Again, this is not in Montgomery, Alabama. This is not in the South. This is in Pennsylvania, right? As late as 1962, there was a public sign posted at one swimming pool outside of Pittsburgh, banning dogs and people of color. And so again, access to nature, access to public amenities, to the legacy of resource conservation, that becomes a key strand of the civil rights movement and, of course, of the environmental movement as well.
That's really hard to hear. That history exists here in the Commonwealth. And you think about from an urban environment, we know that urban areas tend to be warmer. Because of lack of tree cover. So,
and the need for cooling space is that much more important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. The need to be cooled, the need to, and unfortunately, we've reached a point where a lot of our pools are aging out. And so we're starting to see the loss of swimming pools in areas, not just urban, but in suburban as well.
And right across,
cost to operate.
And extremely expensive to operate, right? And I should say, Marcy, and without getting too far into the weeds on this, forgive the pun, but much like with public education, there's a strand in thinking about public amenities in which, at exactly the moment when people of color are sort of breaking down barriers to their full participation in these public amenities, public schools, desegregated swimming pools, public parks, at exactly that moment, you start to see resources being shifted away from the public square into privatized spaces where segregation can continue, right? And so there again, it's as we are thinking about these untold stories of Pennsylvania's environmental history, as we are thinking about the ways in which we as public policy advocates, right, and as those who enjoy the outdoors, we have to think very carefully about the ways in which our race, our class, our gender, other aspects of our identity shape our ability to access these natural resources, these natural amenities that are supposed to have the public benefits for everyone. Yeah. So my last set of my last kind of area to kind of chat about here in Black History Month is the more contemporary era, the era of deindustrialization, right? And Pennsylvania has played this key role in each of these three eras of environmental public policy. They were, Ralph Brock and his contemporaries were at the forefront of the conservation movement nationally, even internationally. The same goes for, Pennsylvania's Rachel Carson, right? For Frank Curry, for others. In this environmental, Maurice Goddard, who kind of launched this environmental movement here in Pennsylvania that has these international consequences. So too in this kind of third era that we are still living in, and that is the environmental justice movement, right? And what I think is so interesting and important, and again, we're still living in this era, we're still kind of working through these issues, is really how do environmental amenities and environmental costs, right, align with the economic benefits and the economic costs, right, associated with them, right? And that's really, the environmental justice movement is really underscoring the need to think about public policies, environmental public policies, and the ways in which they kind of may be written in racialized or gendered neutral terms, but in fact play out in ways that are racially discriminatory or discriminating on other factors, right? And kind of the most important early example for that, and again, this really carries through this legacy of civil rights advocacy, all the way from the early 19th century to the early 21st century. It takes place, there's this really important story that takes place in Chester, Pennsylvania, against the backdrop of massive deindustrialization, right? Between 1970 and 2010, Chester, kind of really the earliest community in Pennsylvania, kind of predating Philadelphia, it is hit hard. Its median family income and its population drops by nearly half in that 40-year period, while the percentage of people of color, Black and Hispanic residents primarily, grows to more than 80%, right? So we have this moment where poverty, economic problems become associated with particular places in Pennsylvania and particular groups of people. We have this shift toward waste incineration and increasingly bigger and bigger waste incinerators. The initial push to do this in a brownfield in South Philadelphia is the residents of that area successfully avoid having that there. They advocate for themselves. They intervene in environmental policy, and as they are looking for, as the advocates know the need for trash disposal, their attention shifts here to Chester. And Chester, the community members in Chester are ambivalent at best about this, right? Because on the one hand, it provides jobs in a community that desperately needs them. But on the other hand, it is literally a trash, it's literally a trash town, right? And so, you see the development of this enormous, one of the largest waste incinerators in the world gets built in Chester. It takes trash from as far away as New York City. And then compounding that issue is that now that we have this waste incinerator here, this becomes then a place where people look to, okay, well, we have that there. Why not group other similar industries around it, right? Water sanitation facilities, medical waste disposal, right? And this is where then that environment, kind of the regulatory state intersects with, good environmental controls intersect with, dumping noxious industries in areas where people can, where it compounds. And as I said, Chester's a community that has a very high population of Black and Hispanic people. And what happens is that in the mid-1990s, a group of Chester residents, including Reverend Horace Strand, who's the pastor of Faith Temple Holy Church, and Zuline Mayfield, form a group, Chester Residents Concerned for Quality Living, a circle, that complains in federal court, accusing state regulators of a, quote, discriminatory effect by, yes, following all of the environmental laws, but using those laws kind of to cluster more and more and more noxious industries here in Chester that have this compounding effect that is discriminatory on its face. And while that lawsuit is ultimately declared moot, it for the first time, establishes that citizens could sue over issues of environmental justice, and the results of that determination get baked into Pennsylvania law going forward.
Yeah, and on the PA Conservation Heritage website, we have a documentary about Zuline and her colleagues' fight to protect their health from the impacts of these industries that were being placed in Chester.
Yeah, and that for me, again, if we're kind of thinking about the ways in which Pennsylvanians, where civil rights advocacy and environmental advocacy overlap with one another, and events that kind of put Pennsylvania and underscore the importance of Pennsylvania as the cradle of conservation, with ramifications that extend not just in Chester, or not just in Pittsburgh, or not just in Harrisburg, but nationally and even internationally, right? This events, Zuline, Circle, Ralph Brock, the fight for civil rights in the suburbs and in public spaces really underscores the significance of Pennsylvania to that broader history.
Yeah, and in fact, I believe now on the Department of Environmental Protection's website, there is an environmental justice map where you can look at areas that are considered, and it's not just population of people, it's economics, and as you said, there are actions that people can take. Now, this was informative, but it was also very uncomfortable to hear these things.
100%.
So, and sometimes we have to have these uncomfortable conversations so that we can move forward. What can people do? I mean, this is, we have the book, we're capturing these histories. People that want to affect a change, what do you recommend?
Well, I first recommend coming and getting involved with the Conservation Heritage Project. We are individuals who have gotten involved with the project, coming from a particular background that simply does not know these stories on a broader level, right? I mean, these are essentially kind of local or individual stories that until they are lifted up, right? Until they are lifted up and shown as exemplars, as models, as significant beyond their individual spaces, we're not going to be able to use them to advocate and to create better public policies going forward. So I think one of the first things folks can do is to get in touch with us with the PA Conservation Heritage Project, and let's work on telling these untold stories, right? My sense too is that there are a lot of local advocacy groups that may not see themselves necessarily as being as part of the social justice movement or the environmental justice movement or a part of the environmental movement. They have other things on their mind, but they are, right? And so for me, being able to build those connections between folks involved in sort of different aspects of making our Pennsylvania a better place for everyone, really thinking carefully about the overlap, the intersections between different efforts can be really important as well.
Great, thank you. And I will say that the PA Conservation Heritage website is scrolling at the bottom of the screen. There is a form on the website where people can share stories or connect with us, so that if you have a story that you'd like to be shared of a person, a place, or an event whose history isn't being shared, please complete the form, reach out to us so that we can capture that. We're all better decision makers when we're informed, and we need to move through some of these uncomfortable conversations and recognize our previous actions, as well as how we can all work together for the benefit of the Commonwealth and our shared good.
Marcy, I couldn't agree more.
Well, Allen, thank you for being here with us. You'll be back next month, same time, same place, literally March 19th at noon. And it is Women's History Month, and we'll be looking at it through the lens of women. And you mentioned that the civil rights movement and the environmental movement is many places went hand in hand, but I would also add that the women's rights movement
Absolutely.
in some countries went hand in hand with these other three things. So, we'll be circling back
and
to
not just in
that.
some of the other countries here in Pennsylvania. I mean, the foot soldiers of the conservation movement, the environmental movement, and the social justice movement have always been women. They haven't always been on the letterhead, but the foot soldiers of these movements have always been women. And, Myra Lloyd Dock is one example of that, but she's just one example. And there are an enormous number of untold stories of the garden club members, right? Of the civic club members, of the playground movement. All of these are movements that are really spearheaded and led by women who are also focused on making Pennsylvania's natural world a better space for everyone.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to talking to you next month. Allen, thank you for being here. Viewers, thank you for being here as well. Talk to you next month.
Until next month.
Bye. I think we'll end.